So I can start again and say good morning, everybody. It seems that a few people have decided to have breakfast in bed and continue watching this event via the internet. That's always the issue with hybrid events. Some of you, the bravest, I can see in the room, and thank you very much for coming. I'm even surprised, I have to say, to see so many people on a morning in Brussels coming here to talk about taxation, the most fascinating topic, you know. So welcome. But I think we're not talking about taxation in reality today. We're talking about something a lot more important. We're talking about survival. And it's a pleasure to welcome you. My name is Olivier Boutelis. I'm the Chief Executive of Accountancy Europe and of ACE Events. So I'm delighted to have you in this venue today, which is a place that we dedicate to policy debates to stimulate thoughts and change, because we need to change. I don't know about you, actually, but I do spend quite a significant amount of my time talking to scientists. You know, these funny people with, you know, big sweaters, lost in numbers and curves and research. And I'm terribly struck by the amount of anxiety, frustration, real deep anxiety of not being heard when they have such an important message, which is that the state of the planet, the conditions that have made life possible on this planet are rapidly deteriorating. And we've been talking now for about, 40 years, that this was an issue for future generations. It's not. It's an issue for our generation. Whatever is our age in the room, I might be part of the oldest these days. It is an issue for our generation. And believe me, it's going to be a lot worse to deal with it when I turn 80 than it will be for people who will be in their 40s at that time. So when you're in this kind of situation, I think you need to leverage every possible tool that you have. And we have a fantastic, extraordinarily powerful policy tool, which is called tax. My colleague has, in the summary paper that supports this event, quoted an ex-president of the United States, someone I'm sure you remember, Ronald Reagan. Apparently not a great friend of taxation, right? But Ronald Reagan said something right. And he said that if you want more of something, you just don't tax it and subsidize it. If you want less of something, you need to tax it. Do we tax carbon? Do we tax it to the right level? I will let you debate this question today. But I would like to not only welcome you, but also thank my colleague Paul, who has been the driving force behind the paper that supports this event. And you see that in this paper, we're really not short of brilliant, innovative ideas on how we could totally reinvent our tax system so that it makes us more happy and that it keeps us on a living planet. Why are these ideas not taken up? That's the question I'm going to leave you debating as well today. So to have this discussion, I'm very grateful that we have a fantastic panel, very important keynote speakers as well. And Paul, can you please introduce them to us? Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Good morning to everyone in person and online. Just some housekeeping. Obviously, we have a hybrid event here. So we will welcome questions both from the audience, which is fairly easy because I'll be able to see hands, but equally, if people online want to leave questions, can you please use Slido? Be aware that there is a slight delay, but basically the sessions we have are fairly common in topics today, so if you have a question that's not initially answered, it may well be it comes up later in another session anyway. We began the Sustainable Tax Systems project back in 2019 with the launch for contributions. Thank you very much for everyone here and online who contributed to this and those that haven't been able to make the event today for whatever reason. We absolutely appreciate the work you put in on behalf of Accountancy Europe, and we welcome the opportunity to allow you to express your views today in person and online. As Olivier said, we think tax is a useful tool for changing behaviour, both by governments and consumers. And the Sustainable Tax Project system was developed to look at the main mega trends that we think the global economy is facing, and then discuss how and receive thought leadership on how tax can positively influence and deal with these mega trends. So the first one, because we do deem it to be the most existential issue at the moment, is obviously climate and the environment, hence we are here today. But in future we will deal with other topics, so please keep your eyes open for that. And equally, Olivier, as Olivier has mentioned, we have produced a summary paper which is now available on our website, which provides the key points from all the contributions we have received. So enough from me. I would like to invite my three panellists that are here today to come up and take their seats, and then I will shortly introduce and hand over to each of them in turn. To save Claudia sitting down and standing back up today, I would like to introduce Claudia Diaz Suarez, independent consultant on sustainability transitions, ESG and climate change, and she will focus on her interconnection between inflation, social fairness and environmental taxes. Claudia.
I would like to greet everybody in the room and thank for this invitation. Thank you to Olivier, and thank you to Paul and everybody in the room that took the time to come here and listen to me so early in the morning. So I've been involved in green taxation for a long time. I was part of the Portuguese Green Tax Reform Commission in 2014, but now I just focus in a very specific and I think up-to-date topic, as Paul mentioned, inflation, social fairness and environmental taxes. So we are living now what is considered to be a climate-flation, though we speak a lot about greenflation, but in fact it's a climate-flation. So we have physical risks that are adding pressure, inflationary pressure into several other prices. So we have both this influence directly and indirectly. So first, directly, we have high temperatures leading to droughts and wildfires, as well as water shortage that is leading to weakened agriculture output. That's the first one. So regarding water shortage, the European Commission mentioned that 50% of the EU territory is under risk. So this is just a number. Regarding weakened agriculture output, the Commission forecasts a reduction in cereal production of 2.5% compared to last year. Italian Confederation of Agriculture mentions a 30% reduction in rice and vegetables and fruit. And in France, the reduction of wheat production is set 7.2%. So the agriculture sector is small in the European Union. I can mention numbers. France is the smallest one in this group of countries that is most threatened by climate change. France is 1.85%, the agricultural sector, and Greece it's almost 5%, so 4.46. These are small, but what we have to keep in mind is that this is a pressure on energy, and this is a pressure on food prices, and this will add to inflationary pressures in general. Regarding the energy crisis, the climate inflation is also putting further problems into the already existent problem, because we have a reduction in hydropower and in nuclear production, as you probably know. So then we have these energy and food prices, inflationary pressures that erode the discretionary spending, tax spending, public spending, which on its turn leads to slow economic growth and then erosion of the fiscal base. So this is a vicious circle. And I mentioned that there are also indirect pressures. Regarding indirect pressures, we have an increase in public expenditure. We have this clear need regarding mitigation, relief packages, health, policies. And for example, Greece in 2021 had to increase its expenditure because of climate change on 0.3%. And the Commission estimates an additional annual fiscal cost for Spain of 4.5% of the GDP, for Portugal 2.1% of the GDP, for Italy 1.7%, for France 1.2%. So this is relevant. And though this can be manageable in the short term, if this kind of events prolong themselves in time and get more intense, as it is expected if we don't take any measures, the problem will be worse. And we have another channel adding to inflationary pressures, the erosion of the fiscal base through the tourism sector. The tourism sector is not like the agriculture sector, not very relevant in these countries. It is very relevant. So we have in Greece, 20% of the GDP coming from the tourist sector. In Spain, 15%, Portugal, 18%, Italy, 13%, France, 9%. So this is a relevant issue. So we have simultaneously with these pressures, we have a country creditworthiness reduction. So these countries are the ones that, regarding sovereign climate risk score, are over 100%. So this creates an additional problem because we have a need for market financing of public expenditure increasing, and simultaneously we have a reduction of where we can get this money because there is less production, an erosion of the fiscal base, then less space for public investment, then less economic growth, then erosion of the fiscal base again, and simultaneously we cannot go to the markets because these countries are paying more and more every day for the money they borrow. So the future expectations are increasingly worse regarding climate change if we don't take effective policy. So if we keep on taking quick fixes, like one I will shortly mention, we will, instead of, for example, a carbon tax, we will have more of this. And when we talk about expectations, future public expectations, we are talking about inflation. So they are directly connected. Inflation is directly dependent on the expectations people have for the future. So this is not expected to become better if we don't take active action and effective action. So some other two aspects worth mentioning is that some anti-inflationary measures are in fact making the problem worse because when we increase the interest rate, we are making the problem of decoupling worse to solve. For example, an increase in fossil fuel in the interest rate of 1% can lead to 8% increase in the fossil fuel projects, but it will lead to a 47 to 60% increase in a renewable energy project because of the technological investment that it's necessary at the beginning. So if we are trying to solve inflation this way, it will just get worse. Then we have the environmental taxes being praised for being efficient, so this is probably the way to go. And now some very short mentions about social fairness. The Eurobarometer just released last week said that 88% of the European citizens are in favor of a fair, sustainable transition that leaves nobody behind. This regards both consumption of green products and jobs. So the biggest impact on the climate footprint comes from the consumption, both in types and amount, of the best well-off in the society, which are, this is true both at societal level, so in each country, but it's also true, as we hear all the time, about countries. So Southern Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere, but we forget a bit inside each country. And in Europe, this is true. They are also the best able to change their behavior, and they are also the ones supporting the inflationary pressures, because they are the last ones to change their behavior if they at all change when the prices keep on going up. And this is evident, for example, in the United States, in the Hamptons region, where the supermarkets keep on raising the prices of food, and the ones that own houses there keep on going to the supermarket, but the ones that just work there have to move out to do their shopping. So if we keep on using blunt, broad-based measures with a regressive impact and adoptable environmental effect, and sometimes a negative environmental effect, we will keep on having a growing problem. And when I mention this kind of measures that are not adequate, I would highlight the VAT reduction for natural gas. This is a short-term fix that won't help. It is it is regressive, and it is not the best way to address energy poverty. Energy poverty should be addressed with targeted measures that are unrelated to energy consumption. So when we use environmental taxes, we are also, because this is a tool to internalize externalities, we are also acting against social dumping. So this is a way to go from my point of view. In the discussion, we can talk about what kind of measures we can take to reconciliate environmental taxes with inflationary pressures, because many people say if we increase the taxes, then we will head to inflationary pressures. But maybe this is not so directly so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And now a test for our systems. So the next speaker we have is Francesco Orsi, Assistant Professor, Wageningen University and Research. Apologies for that. Francesco will speak on implementing a progressive consumption tax on air travel to mitigate the environmental impact of aviation. Francesco. Aha.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation and sorry for not being there. We are facing the worst ecological crisis that possibly humanity has ever faced, and we have to do something soon. And one way of doing this, as it has already been emphasized, is to have externalities internalized via taxation. One way of doing this is through consumption taxes. So basically taxing people's consumption of certain goods that have particularly detrimental effects on the environment and specifically a strong CO2 emission. Now, the problem with, I hope the sound is still...
It is, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, the problem with consumption taxation, notoriously, is that they tend to be regressive. So basically, they place a very strong burden on low-income people, because for low-income people, consumption is a larger share of their income. The best way of making consumption taxes less regressive and actually progressive is to have marginal tax rates increase with consumption, which is basically what happens with income taxes. So the more you make and the higher your marginal tax rate on the top part of your income. So the same should go for consumption taxation. Now, the problem is that, of course, in order to implement this kind of taxation, you should be able to monitor people's consumption. So basically what they buy, when they buy it, how much they buy of it, which is, of course, not easy. Now, and yet there is one good that has these simultaneous characteristics. On the one hand, it has an enormous environmental impact. And on the other hand, its consumption is heavily monitored already today. And this is, of course, air travel. Air travel is supposed to be contributing to the global, approximately between 4 and 5% of global CO2 emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in fact quite a significant portion of overall CO2 emissions, and particularly considering that first, only a very few group of people fly to the present. And second, that there is an expectation for this contribution to increase enormously in the next 10 or 20 years. The other thing that is interesting is that within the flying population, which is this tiny minority of people, there is an even tinier minority that flies all the time. You may have read recently of newspaper articles mentioning that some VIPs, like big athletes or rock stars, whatever, using their private jets can emit in a couple of months the amount of CO2 that a normal average guy can emit maybe in one life or 2 lives, which is pretty shocking. So what should a consumption tax on air travel look like? Well, it should certainly not look like what we have today, because today, as surprising as it can be, we are actually rewarded for flying. So whoever has a frequent flyer program actually receives benefits and incentives to fly more, because the more you fly, and the more you can fly for free, and which is just insane. It's like a perversive incentive to fly. So the idea would be that we should take into account, we should monitor individual flying history, and based on, say, the last 12 months of your flying history, you would be charged a tax on your next flight. And in fact, the more you fly, and the higher this tax rate should be. Now, how to practically implement this? It is not that difficult in many ways. It should be about creating individual accounts that are mandatory for basically buying a flight ticket. And these individual accounts would store all the information regarding our flights. So where we've flown, which class of travel, which airline. And so by storing this information, it would be possible, and very easy actually, to compute the tax rate that you should be paying on your next flight. And this could be based either on the number of flights you've taken in the past months, or the distance you've flown in the now, the idea is that by doing this, we should be able to do two things. On the one hand, hopefully to curb the ever-increasing amount of flying among the top social classes. And so we should be able to curb this down to a more sustainable level without actually preventing average people and low-income people from flying when they need it. And on the other hand, of course, there would be some revenues that would be generated. Now, how could we use these revenues? Well, I see at least two ways of using these revenues. On the one hand, we could use them for funding investment in green aviation technologies, although it's probably not the preferred option because we might assume that this investment would take place anyway. The other way more interesting thing would be to actually invest this money into alternative transportation. So look at Europe, for example, it would be about investing this money into the train system. We all know all too well that if you want to travel between countries in Europe, it's not necessarily easy and cheap. Even just buying the tickets sometimes is a bit of a nightmare. So the revenues from this taxation could go into making international train transportation faster, cheaper, easier to choose. So yeah, this is my small proposal, but one that I think could be implemented with a relatively limited effort. Thank you.
Let's go. Next up, we have Kyle Pomerleau, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he will be talking about carbon taxes and how they may be a missed opportunity in the context of the US. Kyle?
Yeah, thank you very much. As Paul mentioned, my name is Kyle Pomerleau. I'm a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute based in Washington, D.C. In my 5 minutes, I'm going to just make three main points. So the first point is that a broad-based carbon tax is more effective and efficient than other popular climate policies that are debated both here and back in the United States. So what do I mean by a carbon tax? I mean that it's an excise tax on the carbon content of goods broadly in the economy. It applies to as many greenhouse gases as administratively possible, and it's border adjusted, meaning that it would apply to imports coming into a country, but it would excuse exports that are leaving and goods that would be consumed in other jurisdictions. So why is this better than other policies? So one, it's technologically neutral. So it encourages businesses and consumers to reduce their consumption of dirtier goods and shift towards cleaner goods and cleaner types of technologies. And it doesn't presume the best technologies. So while wind and solar may be good today, those may not necessarily be the best technologies 50 years from now. And a carbon tax allows producers and consumers to figure that out on their own. Second, it covers more activity than other policies. So a lot of policies, subsidies, or regulations are just on the power sector, or just encourage the purchase of electric vehicles, or maybe just on airline flights. A carbon tax, on the other hand, would apply broadly throughout the economy, so it wouldn't be discriminatory in that way. And it's also more efficient than types of regulations and subsidies. So an example is EV credits, or credits for electric vehicles, very popular in the United States. A carbon tax would be more effective, and why would that be the case? Well, credit is going to encourage individuals to purchase an electric vehicle. That's good. That gets internal consumption or combustion engines off the road. But then it doesn't really tell consumers what to do after that. So in the United States, for example, you're going to plug in your electric vehicle to the outlet. You're not really going to care about where the electricity is coming from. It could be coming from a coal-fired power plant or from a more green source, but an electric vehicle credit is not going to tell you which to do, whereas a carbon tax will price the entire process, both the purchase of the vehicle, and it's going to dictate what type of energy you use to clean that up, or to use to power up your vehicle. Second point here is because a carbon tax raises revenue, it can directly address some of the downsides of climate policies or excise taxes in general. So the two big concerns about climate policy is, one, their impact on economic output. You're increasing burdens for producers and consumers. That's going to have an impact on investment and the incentive to work in the economy. And second, its distributional impact. So a carbon tax is an excise tax. As mentioned previously, it's going to have a larger burden on low-income households than higher-income households. And a modest carbon tax of, say, $50 per metric ton in the U.S. context can raise up to 1% of GDP in additional revenue each and every year. And that can be used to offset some of these downsides. So if it's economic growth you're concerned about, it could be used to reform the existing tax code in a country to spur more growth. Or it can be used to provide transfers or tax cuts to low-income households to offset the regressive impact of an excise tax. Then my last point, my third point here, is when discussing the burden of carbon taxation versus other policies, I think it's important to take a step back and think that the carbon tax is not alone in how it has these potential downsides of burdening low-income households. So because they're often said to be regressive, that's viewed as a big downside of carbon taxes. But they're not alone in their potential burden on low-income households. For example, there are a lot of regulations that can also burden low-income households more than high-income households. There's research, for example, of what are called U.S. CAFE standards that dictate the fuel efficiency of vehicles in the United States. These regulations require producers to produce certain types of cars, and these cars end up being slightly more expensive than they would be in the absence of these fuel efficiency standards. And higher prices for vehicles, just like a consumption tax, is going to place a heavier burden on low-income households than high-income households. Now, that's very similar to a carbon tax. However, a CAFE standard doesn't raise revenue, so it doesn't have the additional benefit of having being able to distribute that revenue to households to offset the burden on low-income households. So just wrapping up here, I think that a carbon tax is what lawmakers, both here and in the United States, should pursue as climate policy. I think it's more effective and efficient than other policies. But I think the challenge in order to enact such a thing isn't administrability or anything fundamentally wrong with it. I think it's political at the end of the day, and that a lot of the effort should be focused on convincing lawmakers and stakeholders that it's the right way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And next up to the podium, can I please invite Chiara Putataro, EU Inequality and Tax Policy Advisor at Oxfam. And Chiara will speak on the interaction between environmental taxation and inequality and how to avoid negative effects of environmental taxation. Chiara?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and also thank you very much to involve a civil society organization in the compendium that you have created, and for this event. So Oxfam work on taxation for the impact that taxation has on inequality, and I'm really glad that all the speakers before already mentioned these issues of inequality. So it's something that we all really care. And in particular, when looking at environmental taxation, then the interaction with inequality is relevant, is interesting. We can look at this interaction from a broad perspective and a smaller perspective. The broader perspective is the different responsibility and consequences of the climate change. We know that low-income countries have a smaller historical carbon footprint than high-income countries, and also within the countries, the poor households have lower historical carbon footprint. I mentioned some statistics that Oxfam has collected. The richest 10% of the world population were responsible for over half of the world total carbon emission from 1990 to 2015, while the poorest 50% was responsible for just the 7%. And another analysis by Jason Heikel showed that the industrialized countries were historically responsible for 90% of the excess emission. So it is clear how there is a common but differentiated responsibility. And we can see this inequality also in terms of consequences. The impact of the climate crisis is much more devastating for those living in low-income countries, and within these countries for the most vulnerable groups, women and ethnic minorities in particular. So it is important to have this big inequality picture in mind when we address the different kind of environmental taxation. And here I go to I pass to the smaller picture. So the regressive impact that some environmental taxation can have, in particular consumption environmental taxation, and specifically the carbon tax that was mentioned before. As was said, that the carbon tax has a heavy burden on the budgets of low-income households compared to high-income people. And this is because it's generally a flat tax. There are not differentiation among this according to the gender, to the income, and low-income households tend to spend a higher proportion of their budget on certain kind of goods, like for example the fuel for the heating of the houses, or the fuel for transport. And in addition to that, poor households cannot afford to pay for example, energy efficiency upgrade or electrical car. And also concerning the transport fuel tax, poor households usually they live in more far peripheric areas, so they with lower public transport supply. And so it's important to take this into account, considering that in general, in some countries, the tax system is becoming more regressive. So if we add also this additional regressive tax, so the impact on the poor family will be even higher. But the good news is that there are ways to address this regressive impact and also to mitigate it. Of course, the first step is to do a comprehensive impact assessment to see how the poorest and also the low-income countries, if we speak about international kind of taxation. So comprehensive impact assessment to see the impact. And then I would say that there are three main ways to address this problem. So first of all, I think we should avoid, in the first place, to have a regressive environmental tax. Speaking about the carbon tax, we could think about different tax rate according to the groups or the sector. Or we could address specific goods that are consumed by rich people, like the first class flights or yacht or polluting cars like the SUV. Then it's also, so we talk about consumption tax, but sometimes maybe it would be better to target the production and the investment that targets mainly companies and investors and more indirectly consumers. So this would be a way also to shift the responsibility of the transition to those that are most able to pay. Then second, if the regressive impact cannot be avoided, then, as was said before, it is important to have in place redistribution mechanism. And this could be financed by the tax itself. And third, it is important to have alternative in place. So, for example, a good public transport system or bike paths. If we introduce so a tax on the transport fuel. And I conclude saying that, so in addition to taxation, we have always to consider that there are other instruments and implement them at the same time. So there is regulation and there are, for instance, investment. It is important to offer alternatives. So the inequality environmental taxation can be reconciled, we can find a solution to reconcile these two terms, but the main thing is to start to recognize that there is a broader inequality in terms of responsibility and causes of climate change. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Finally, in this session at least, we have Arthur ten Wolde. Yes, there he is, Executive Director of Ecopreneur EU. Arthur will speak on why a tax shift and new VAT measures are vital for creating a sustainable economy. Arthur?
Yes, Paul, thank you. Can you hear me?
Very strongly.
Okay, good. Well, thanks first of all for inviting me for this event, which I also very much welcome, since in my world at least there are so few events discussing tax measures for the circular economy and sustainability. So thank you for the event in the first place and for the opportunity. So I would like to speak about why low VAT rates for sustainable products and services, by the way, are needed for a circular and sustainable economy. Next slide, please. So first of all, on whose behalf am I speaking? I'm speaking as the Executive Director of Ecopreneur.eu. Ecopreneur Europe is the political voice of sustainable businesses in Europe, because we represent about 2,900 small and medium-sized enterprises and 100 larger enterprises in 7 member states, and all of these are dedicated to sustainable products and services. The goal of Ecopreneur Europe is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable economy. And we are still the only cross-sectoral business organization at EU level that is committed to bold sustainability policies. So next slide, please. Why VAT differentiation? Well, first of all, and this is shared by all our members, because true pricing should be, in our opinion, the basis for the whole economy. Because we don't have fair pricing, we have a very unlevel playing field to be entrepreneurial, and therefore there's much unfair competition that should be ended. Another reason why VAT is because it can be very effective to nudge consumers towards sustainable products and services. There have been objections against the whole idea of implementing low VAT because there have been cases where, for instance, hair dryers were put in a low VAT box and it didn't really have a lot of impact. But that is because that's not the right way to do it. You should only put low VAT on the sustainable hair dryers in this case. And then all the others will become more expensive and then consumers will be nudged. So this argument is not correct. So this can nudge consumers, and most of all, it is needed to accelerate the transition to a sustainable economy for the reasons that were already so well explained by the previous speakers. Another reason is that it is politically much easier than increasing taxes. Ecopreneur does also support the whole tax shift, and we are also a member of an organization arguing for high taxes on meat. But this is much more difficult. Some politicians call it a hot potato or political suicide. And on the contrary, in 2021, in December, the European Council was able to put several product groups in a low VAT box. So to the next one, please. Next slide. Can you go one back, please? Yes, okay. Because why VAT differentiation? A sustainable economy could be readily achieved given sufficient political will. This is, I think, also a bit also already touched on by previous speakers. For instance, a carbon tax can be very effective, and we also agree it would be very efficient. However, we think it's not enough for the same reason. You are trying to make things more expensive. That is politically very much more difficult. The next thing is that right now the EU VAT directive in principle forbids low VAT. That is unfortunate. Member states that want it cannot do it. Unfortunately, the decision in 2021 was that it's now possible for solar panels, bicycles, waste treatment and vegetables and fruit, in addition to earlier already on a list of repair services, resold goods and maybe a bit unclear, but transactions with clearly defined social reasons. However, this is still not enough. And why is this not enough? Then to the next slide, please. So what you see now is a schematic overview of the transition into a new economy, where the gray area is where we are now, and the blue line from bottom to top is waiting for new policies that are still not there. Because the new economy has two parts. One is the growth of the 3,000 that we have, but also other sustainable companies that should grow into the new economy. And at the same time, the blue line represents conventional industry and multinationals that should turn around into the new economy. And what is missing here, first of all, to make the small ones grow, is a low VAT, but also extended producer responsibility with eco-modulation of the fee. And on the other hand, for the conventional ones, the turnaround there, the whole tax shift is still missing. And both are needed. By the way, the tax shift will also help growing the small ones, but it's too slow. So, next slide, please. How to introduce low VAT rates? Well, first of all, our members stress that we want to be a temporary measure for all product groups. As soon as the whole system has become sustainable and circular, then the VAT rates can be brought back to normal. It should include renewable energy, for instance, cradle-to-cradle products, lease or rent with product return and recycling provisions, and others, of course, eventually all product groups. Especially for products because they can be self-effective, tax neutral because this can be a large part of the total tax revenue. It should be impact based. There are some objections against the VAT, low VAT for sustainable products are that it's maybe difficult for governments to determine what is sustainable. But this is a general problem and it can be solved. Then it should be designed so that it prevents leakage. You can use material-specific fiscal tariffs where needed. And a thing behind this, so why is this not being implemented, was one of the questions asked at the beginning. Well, that is, as many people know, that the EU should switch in their decision-making on tax matters from unanimous to majority. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Arthur. We're running a bit behind schedule, but we have time for a question or two. Do we have anything from the audience? The microphone's on its way.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Dilemma with Tech Notes. I have a question for Francesco Orsi. He mentioned some sort of history into what the, I can't speak English, sorry. He mentioned that we should have a tax on your flights and that we should have some sort of history. I'm just wondering how this would be compliant with GDPR rules. Thank you.
Francesco, are we?
That's the relevant question. I assume it wouldn't be too much of a problem considering that most of our consumption is already tracked today via credit cards and internet and purchases. Yeah, also not necessarily this information would be disclosed to third party. It would be just internally processed and used to calculate the tax rate for your next flight. It could be, of course, anonymized, and also all sensitive information could be.
We're getting a bit. Could you speak up a bit, Francesco?
Sorry. Yeah. So I think it wouldn't be too much of a problem because I guess most of our consumption is already tracked today because we purchase online and we use credit cards. I also think that the information should be anonymized and simply internally processed to compute the next tax rates for our next flight. The flight history, I assume, could also be just translated in the amount of kilometers that we've flown. So if the problem is to, let's say, to record the fact that you have flown to, say, London or Stockholm or whatever, we can also translate this directly into a number of kilometers. And then at that point, there would be no destinations associated with your own profile. It would be just number of kilometers. So I think in principle, it shouldn't be too much of a problem, but of course, it's also an issue to explore further.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Any further questions in the audience?
Thanks. A question for Kyle, please, about the methane pricing fee in the US in the Inflation Reduction Act. Could you enlighten us about that? Because it's an maybe an inspiring example for the EU as well.
Is that, we can hear me? Okay, so yeah, in the Inflation Reduction Act, lawmakers included a small fee on methane in the United States. And this, I think, in a sense, is a carbon pricing mechanism, but it's just very, very narrow. And I think it's equivalent to something like $20 to $25 per metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in the United States, I think carbon pricing is a political non-starter, so you have to ask, like, how did this policy make it into the Inflation Reduction Act? How did it become law, even though it's a tax increase, which is something that doesn't happen often in the United States? I think that the reason it's there is because it's so narrow, that it's only on a few select producers in the United States. It can at least be conceivably argued politically that it's not going to fall on consumers, even though it definitely will. It's going to place a burden on consumers more broadly. But I think the lesson there is this idea of salience, or how noticeable a tax increase is in the grand scheme of things. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's about an $80 billion fiscal package. The methane fee is just a small piece of that.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I missed it, but carbon tax will be direct or indirect tax? And if direct, how are you going to mitigate double taxation on the same moment of taxation, the services or a product?
The way that or in my mind, the way a carbon tax could be structured is that it would be an indirect tax. In the United States, for example, you can cover most carbon emissions by applying the tax on just a couple thousand producers. So these producers would be at the point of extraction of fuels, for example, or the refining of fuels. From there, you're covering most of the carbon content of a lot of goods in the United States. Now, in terms of double taxation, that prevents it to a large degree because you're just looking at a small number of producers. So it's not, I think it would be much harder to avoid double taxation and administer the tax in general if it's at, say, the consumer side where you enact something that looks like a value-added tax. I think that's much harder to do.
Thank you very much. We also have a couple of online questions. Johan?
Indeed. So a couple of online questions actually about the OECD BEPS Pillars 1 and 2. One of them is a bit more general, the other one is a bit more specific. I'll maybe read that one out. How would a minimum 15% tax reconcile with sustainability-related tax incentives and credits? And there's a broader question about, as well about, in general, do you think that the OECD BEPS Pillars 1 and 2 initiatives pose a threat to creating a tax system supporting the green transformation? So anyone in the panel willing to take this?
Yeah, I will take it. So one of the challenges with Pillar 2 specifically is it's trying to set a minimum tax rate on multinational corporations throughout the world in one way that a lot of countries, the United States is a big offender here, in that they enact carbon mitigation policies or climate change policies through the tax code in a way that reduces the effective tax rate of corporations, whether it's for production or for investment. Those things reduce effective rates, sometimes far below 15%. Now, the way Pillar 2 is structured to get around this is that there's a way that you can structure credits and subsidies through the tax code that wouldn't trigger the tax. The distinction, you can think of it as whether the credit is above the line or below the line. Now, a credit that's above the line is one that's added to a company's profits when tax calculation is done, and then below the line is a credit that subtracts from tax liability. It's only that latter type of credit that would be clawed back by Pillar 2. And then the United States, in the Inflation Reduction Act, they enacted a 15% a minimum tax on financial statement income. Politically, they did consider the impact of that tax on these subsidies, and what they did is they just exempt all general business credits from this minimum tax. So for large multinationals in the United States, your minimum tax is 15%. except in the case where you get a rate below 15 through general business credits for green energy. So that's one way that that this Pillar 2 can be consistent with these policies. But also another way is that countries can stop enacting climate policy through existing income taxes and could instead enact broad-based excise taxes on carbon emissions, like a carbon tax. That is another way that you can avoid such a tension.
Sure.
Can I add something regarding this use of reduction of the tax? Closer? Yeah, it's closer, it's working. Okay. So what is relevant to mention here is that when you use carbon offset credits, together with carbon taxes, we can improve the efficiency of the tax, and it could work as a follow-up of your answer. Instead of using the income tax, we could use this carbon tax with carbon offset credits that would increase the efficiency of the tax on carbon itself. So we could still improve the system and take in line what OECD is proposing on tax measures.
Does anyone of our speakers online, has anyone got a hand up?
Yeah, just the final remark that about the carbon taxes is in favor of a CBAM, so that's the carbon border. It was the AFOR, some kind of adjustment mechanisms, could not be called a tax, but it's effectively a tax, for all products and services, again, to ensure that there is no unfair competition for sustainable producers in Europe compared to this happening out of Europe. So we are in favor of such a carbon board mechanism measure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think now we need to take a short break. We're still a bit uncertain as to the timing when MEP Paul Tang will turn up. So if we could take a 10-minute break now, if everyone in the room and online could be back by 11:35, I'd be very appreciative. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed their break. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the next session. So we have Benjamin Angel, Director, DG Taxud, the European Commission for Direct Taxes, and MEP Paul Tang, Chair of the FISC Subcommittee on Tax Matters. And interviewing them, moderating them is Femke Groothuis, Founder and President of the X-Tax Project. So please, over to Femke.
Thank you. Hello? Yes, here we are. Thanks. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very pleased to be on stage with these gentlemen who are very much involved in the discussion around the tax mix of the future, which is the subject of this session. In the context of environmental taxation, obviously, but there's a longer term, mid to long term perspective that we'd like to look at in this panel particularly. Maybe just a few words on my role. I'm the president of the X-Tax Project. For the past 13 years, we have researched the dynamics of labor taxes versus environmental taxes and how we could help support businesses to apply more circular and inclusive business models to shift to the goals that we've set across the EU. So many thanks to Accountancy Europe for having this session today, and it's again a pleasure to meet my panelists. So what is a fair and sustainable tax system? That's the key question, and how to design financial incentives to be aligned with the goals that we've set across the EU. The Green Deal actually states that shifting the tax burden away from labor and onto natural resources should be a way forward, and the Commission has been calling upon member states for more than 30 years to actually apply these principles of polluter pays as well as leaving no one behind. So we'll be talking about the future of tax in a minute, but first let's take a look at the current situation. Mr. Angel, please, from the perspective of the Commission, what do you think happening? What is the Commission working on right now that fits in the profile of environmental taxation and a future-proof tax system?
Thank you. Is it working? Yes, it's working. Well, we are still in the process first of negotiating the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. This directive is extremely outdated. It has not been updated in more than 20 years. It sets floors to taxation, but which are set at such a low level that they have become meaningless over time because they were set in absolute value without even having an indexation. So what we're trying to do is to modernize it, to take into account the need to disincentivize, notably the use of fossil fuels, so as to boost our energy autonomy. It's a difficult discussion. It has always been. We have failed in the past to reform the ETD, so this is a second attempt. But member states are engaged and are committed to it. The second big legislation which is being discussed, so strictly speaking, this is not taxation, it's connected to taxation. It's a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which aims at reducing the risk of carbon leakage coming from our ambitious legislation, which would be more ambitious than the one that we have abroad, and incentivizing third country producers to reduce their carbon footprint by equalizing the carbon price which is paid at the border to the one that is paid domestically. It is also progressing quite well in trilogues now, so we hope that the co-legislator will find an agreement in the coming future. It's an important milestone. But we are also well aware that in the current circumstances, we need to go beyond those existing texts. And you have seen that we have done in September a package, which again is not taxation strictly speaking, but which is connected to taxation and which is to be implemented for a large part by tax administration. We came with a revenue cap for producers and also a solidarity contribution on fossil fuel, mandating on member states that the proceeds have to be used to offset part of the energy costs that are experienced at the moment by businesses and citizens, but also to help financing investments in the very technologies that would boost our energy autonomy, starting with, obviously, renewables. And in that sense, the package will also help making steps in the right direction.
Thank you. Mr. Tang, from your perspective, from the European Parliament and the FISC Committee, how do you see things progressing? What do you see happening?
It's always mixed, isn't it? Mixed progress. Now, like one of the major steps, and of course it's not a tax, it's not to be called a tax, but that's the CBAM, right? It's been a theoretical concept out there for years that has been put in practice, turned into practice, a practical proposal by the Commission in a very short time, but which I think is essential to have a full-fledged ETS system. And let's face it, pricing carbon is one of the big issues. Absolutely, you want to have the introduction of the polluter-pay principle. That can be done much more broadly, but this is one of the big steps that has been taken. A bit to my surprise, that it's also be accepted by the international partners, right? It's not some it could have set off at first reaction. I hope it will not. At the same time, progress is missed because if you look at other applications of the polluter-pay principles, for example, tax on kerosene, which I've ever since I've been in politics and for quite some time, for sort of discussing a tax on kerosene, it's still not there, right? So that is mixed. There's one other, because I see this as a fireside chat, so I started to relax now a bit, because this is just a fireside chat, right? Other part of sustainability, I think it should be also, I think, is the issue of equity or fairness. And this is what I find at this stage, I'm wondering, because what you see nowadays, there is, we had compensation in the COVID crisis, we now have compensation in the energy crisis, so we have huge expenditures. And what is happening on the tax side? A bit to my surprise, where are the deficits hawks when you need them, so to say? It's a weird situation that we see increasing deficits, we already high debt and increasing debt, and at the same time the interest rate is pushed up. And we see expansionary budget even pushing the interest rates further up. And I don't think this is a very credible policy mix. What I fail to see is that there are governments out there that are willing to raise taxes to reduce the deficit and to also to put the burden on the shoulders. Because you can have targeted compensation by being relatively generous to direct compensation to households. And at the same time, you could also raise taxes on the big corporates or on the very wealthy. And fortunately, there is at least a solidarity contribution where you see the taxation on the windfall profits. But I sort of start to think, is there a taboo on taxation or not? But I think this would be a very good time to, because I always believe, but maybe that also tells you something of my political background, I think sustainability needs to be social.
Yes, exactly. So what we can conclude is that there are things happening. I'm personally particularly interested in the extension of the ETS towards the shipping sector and the aviation sector. Putting a price on pollution by those sectors, I think, will be key in future, whether it's a tax or another levy that somehow does end up in the treasuries of, in the coffers of the governments. So there is a lot of work being done, but we also can conclude probably that it's not yet enough. We're running into a large number of system crises. We have huge ambitions for 2030 in terms of carbon reduction, but also, for example, pesticide reduction by 50%, unemployment to be reduced, 87% of people in employment, 50% less food waste, etc. The challenges are huge. And since about half of global carbon emissions are related to materials sourcing and extraction and use, I think, you know, shifting to the circular economy will be key as well. So the tax system currently isn't aligned with those goals, and 50% of tax revenues are based on labor taxes. So how do we go from a situation where linear activities are the most profitable and therefore scalable for business towards a situation where circular activities, which include a lot of services like repair and maintenance services and refurbishment, but also the energy transition is very labor intensive. You know, think of retrofitting an older home. It's customized work. So how do we connect those dots? Do you think that tax reform could actually play a key role in the transition to achieving those goals? And do you see opportunities to expand the focus of policies across the EU? Mr. Angel.
It's a difficult question, particularly under the current circumstances. Normally, when we talk about green taxation, energy taxation, we do it having in mind to use taxation as a way to guide the market signals so as to help changing the behavior. Obviously, the market signals have gone nuts for the time being. So I guess no one would want to make it worse for the time being, but fortunately, this should be temporary. And as soon as we are back to a normal situation, then the importance of having taxation as a way to guide behaviors comes back on the forefront again. You're right that the importance of green taxation in particular is limited for the time being. It represents around 6% of the income of member state. To give you an order of magnitude, this is more or less what the corporate income tax represents. But clearly, labor taxation dwarfs by far any use of green taxation. When boosting green taxation, we have to take several elements into consideration that make it a relatively complex equation. First, member state needs sustainable resources. So by definition, this need for sustainable resource creates natural limit on what you can do with taxation when it is constructed as a behavioral tax. It is as a tax to change a behavior, because if it works and the resource does not come in, or not to the extent that was envisaged. Second, the use of tax benefit is entirely dependent on the scope of the taxation itself. Let me explain. In a high number of member states, the personal income tax today is paid only by a fraction of the household. For instance, the country I know best, I'm French, only 50% of the household paid the personal income tax. If you come with tax benefit to accompany the energy transition, for instance, to incentivize people to renovate their house or to move to greener cars, de facto, everything you do is socially regressive, because it only benefits those paying the tax, and those paying the tax are the 50% richer. So we have real design issue in a significant number of countries when thinking about green taxation, but it doesn't mean that we should not do it. And clearly, the Commission has been advocating for many years for a tax shift by reducing the importance of labor taxation and increasing a bit the importance of green taxation wherever we can. It is still an important tool, and a tool that we need to use more going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting point you raise, where, so first of all, green taxes can be regressive, but of course, it's not the tax itself that's regressive, it's the system that's regressive. And to address the impact, you have to address the systemic issues in terms of poverty reduction and fair, decent jobs, etc. So, and also, if there's anything regressive, it's climate change and it's air pollution, for example, because the lowest income groups pay the highest price for those impacts. So you know, having to deal with both of those, how do we make sure, how can we learn more across the EU as to how to support low-income groups, reduce the cost of labor for employers as well? And this goes beyond personal income tax, but also it looks at payroll taxes, social contributions, and support mechanisms in the economy. Mr. Tang, do you think there's a way that both research and sharing experiences can help member states to address these issues more effectively? How do you see that in future?
Sorry, it works. The point that Benjamin makes is very interesting, I think, and that we have income tax systems that are not able to redistribute. And that's not just the case in France. I can also see that for the Netherlands. And one of the problems is that we have the mix of social security and tax systems. And what we lack, at least in the Netherlands, and I think in many other countries, is the possibility of negative income taxes. Would it be much easier to redistribute to the group that you want to redistribute to? And I don't think there are many successful examples of negative income taxes in Europe. US is one of the but that would significantly help to. I learned that lesson already in Dutch politics. It's very hard to distribute to the lower income groups. The other point that I was also trying to make at the start. So you always say we need to go from we need to reduce taxes on labor and increase taxes on pollution. And the point is, if you look at the numbers, this is also reducing the taxes on households and increasing the direct tax on corporates. We have been very poor at doing that. This is why increasing yes. the taxes on. So if you look at the burden of environmental taxes, it's more than 100% for households. It's much less for corporates, and it's even much less for agriculture. And this shows what kind of resistance there is to this system. And that's the reason why CBAM was so important, because it's under the competitive pressure or under the argument of competitive pressures that corporates and other firms tend to have exceptions to the rule of polluter pays, and these exceptions are huge. They become entire holes in the system. And this is what we need to address. Yeah, are there good examples? Probably out there, but it's also, let's be clear, it's also going to be a fight, right? And looking at my own country, we're in deep fight now with farmers, up to the point that it's even scary. So the resistance is real hard.
Yes, that's totally observable. So you mentioned the fact that often green taxes are directed towards households. Wouldn't it be much easier to direct them towards the bigger polluters, the bigger users, in terms of, you know, their power to change their production processes is much higher than the average consumer can reduce the carbon content or the water usage for a particular product. So, for example, pricing water in the Netherlands is based on the first 300 cubic meters of water that we use is taxed. But if you use more, there's no tax on water. So that is a regressive way of dealing with it. It would be better to turn it around and have a tax-free threshold, and then people having to pay, but also the larger users. In our report, we have suggested to look at a broader scope of green taxes across the EU, to set minimum rates across the EU for particular types of resource uses, but also provide guidance as to the use of revenues that suits the national circumstances in terms of social impact. We've also suggested to create a more clear public tax policy tracker, so we know better what is happening in each country, in each member state, and we can coordinate the steps. Are those suggestions that you at the Commission can work with, and at the Parliament, or do you see other opportunities to collaborate and to coordinate this transformation?
Well, there are some processes that we try to use to this effect to the maximum possible extent. Traditionally, we had the European semester and the country report. But my experience for having been in charge of almost half of the member state for some time in DG ECFIN in the Commission is that the attention paid to the recommendation that comes within the framework of the country report is extremely viable. When I was coming to some new member states to present it, full room, some ministers, television, press, in the large country in Western Europe, people didn't even know it existed, basically. Yeah? The Recovery and Resolution Fund has allowed to make further progress, clearly, because there's a big difference between making recommendation and making big recommendation that allows you to access a big pot of money. So in that sense, we have tried to incentivize member states to develop green taxation in particular, and 14 countries within the RRF process have committed to take measures in this field. For instance, Portugal, to give just one example, is introducing a landfill tax. So we're trying to use all the tools we have, how satisfactory or unsatisfactory they are, but it's not a discussion where one size fits all, very clearly, because depending on the tax structure, depending on the structure of the economy, there is a need for fine-tuning at national level. And this is why we need to engage constructively with member states. We will monitor what they're doing. We have also the technical support instrument, which help financing reform and providing advice to member states on how to design it. And we need to fuel the discussion. That's one of the reasons why the Commission is also organizing a big tax symposium on the 28th of November, for which green taxation will be an important part of the agenda.
Thanks. I'm very pleased to be on a panel on the 28th, so I hope I see you then again. Yeah, so how do we shift from debating specific measures and solutions within those measures towards a more systemic approach where we take a mid to long-term perspective on taxes and, let's say, the evolution of the tax mix, and then fit the specific measures in there? That is one of the recommendations that we've given. And I was curious as to how maybe FISC could have a role in that. Do you see opportunities for the European Parliament to play a role in that mid to long-term planning and perspective on the tax mix of the future?
Yeah, thank you. Somehow I'm a bit stuck in what is the political economy of taxation, so to say. So this, because you say we need to shift from labor to environment, the taxation, right? But that's also from household to corporates, and that proves to be very difficult. Unless it's done in a coordinated way. For example, on CBAM, why is CBAM important? Because the ETS system had the free allocation of rights, because some sectors needed to be maintained competitiveness. The CBAM is necessary, therefore, to complete the ETS. That is the underlying mechanism. What that means that taxation is not always the best place to coordinate, right? Because we are stuck then in unanimity. So you also have standards and norms, which may very well help to achieve what we want to achieve, to have a coordinated change. Because in my experience, I don't think corporates don't mind really paying their taxes, whether it be it's corporate taxes or other taxes, as long as their competitors also pay it, right? So that's what we need to achieve. Now, and so that makes taxation sometimes a somewhat difficult tool to put forward. Then again, there's one other change which makes me. I realized it also yesterday that more and more our framework for corporate disclosure is starting to develop, and that will also help. Therefore, I think to change the debate. Because now we have the disclosure, we now have referred to as the SF, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. We now have the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and there's all double materiality in there. And what I also more and more see that even in the US this is accepted. This is going to help us a lot, I think, because because then it becomes part and parcel of the corporate life, that you try to minimize your impact on the environment. And I think I very much hope that will also change the debate, because it's a coordinated change, right? It would be good if not just takes place in Europe, but also in the US. And well, then we could get more support also from the corporate side, and are really looking forward for either measures in forms of regulation or in the form of taxation. And to be clear, I'm an economist by training, so I like to have the taxation because it gives you the price incentive. But then again, as a politician, I also see that with the unanimity vote on taxation, it's sometimes, well, bloody difficult.
Yes, I understand, and every effort is much appreciated, of course, within the sphere of influence of each of the players in Brussels and in across the EU. So we do recognize that it's a fundamental issue. We do recognize that there are steps being taken. We do recognize that it's not enough, but there's a political barrier to acting, I guess, more firmly and more in a more coordinated way. I think the challenge will be for the next, well, year, I guess, with the kickoff of the tax mix of the future event, to figure out ways around the limitations that there are in each of those aspects, to include both social and environmental issues equally in the debate, because they're both they're two sides of the same coin, basically. So I think we have to end at this point. We have more time. Oh, good. Oh, then that's great. So we can talk about a little bit more. Would you like to share with the audience as to how the role of, I mean, the thing is that, of course, the EU Institute, the taxation is a national competency, right? Mostly. How can, I'm still looking for a way to move around the fact that it's a national competency, and that there's also a need for coordination, because, if one country takes one measure and the others don't, I mean, there's always border effects, etc. So to do this in a coordinated way would be so valuable and so necessary. So how do we deal with the difficulty of the different political mandates, and how do we bring together players from different countries to collaborate and to share information and examples in order to advance in the same direction? So this is my quest. How do we work around the limitations that are in our system? Is there anything you'd like to share for your perspective? I mean, it's pretty amazing that we have an ETS in the EU, right? That's amazing that it worked out and it's functioning and it's working, and it's also raising revenues. I mean, it's called an emission trading system, but it also raises revenues for the treasuries of our countries, which they are at their disposal to use for the goals that they see fit. Can we learn from the ETS process as to going forward in creating more of these types of policies?
Well, I think the main hurdle is the one that Paul mentioned. It's unanimity. You have to keep in mind that the ETS just requires QMV. Whether we would have been able to do the ETS with unanimity is a real question. I have an idea of the answer. My experience of nearly 3 decades in the institution is that when you operate under QMV, you almost all the time end up with unanimity, because those who know that they will be outvoted tend to rally the consensus. When you operate under a unanimity requirement, which is a case of taxation, the dynamic is very difficult. Because even if you convince your interlocutors, the government, sometimes the national parliament or some national other political party know that they can block, and they cannot claim that they have been outvoted. They cannot claim that they could resist and did not. So basically, we end up in a very difficult situation, and that creates something which I don't like much, which is the EU legislative framework in the field of taxation is primarily from a business point of view rather punitive, because we do manage to obtain unanimity when we talk about exchanging information, when we talk about fighting tax evasion, tax avoidance, not in the field of direct taxation. But each time we come with a more positive agenda, like what's the case, for instance, with the CCCTB from years ago, which was a big text, we fail. And that creates some kind of punitive framework by default, not that the EU doesn't want to have also do, but somehow we get unanimity only on the don't, not on the do. It doesn't mean that things are completely impossible. There are areas where we have EU legislation. First, there's an abundant legislation in the indirect taxation field, and one bit is clearly relevant for our discussion, that the excise duty legislation, which is harmonized at the European level. We have an important VAT legislation, but in the direct taxation field, where we have moved away from a situation where 15, 20 years ago there was almost nothing, to now a significant number of legislation, we still have this difficulty of building legislation which is outside the field of tax evasion or aggressive tax planning. As Commissioner Gentiloni put it in eloquent term at the beginning of his mandate, the main difficulty in the tax field is to be able to make progress in between two tax scandals. When there is a tax scandal, okay, there is a willingness. By good weather, very difficult to get unanimity.
Yeah. Paul, yeah.
So I like your quest. So there's one answer. We have more scandals. So people, if you have some documents around, please come forward. This is the time to come forward. We need one. The other way to make progress was already mentioned. So I like your quest, right? So how to make change, how to make change in the right direction. Other one was mentioned also by Benjamin. I think we have for many years relied on the stick, and now we have the carrot of the RRF, which makes the recommendations from the Commission much more leveraged than before. And I think that helps. Maybe not enough, but it helps. So in that sense, a change in that system would also benefit a great deal. Not to rely, have more carrots on that will move forward. And the other is, of course, the third option that came to my mind is the system of a scenario of chaos. Because what the corporates, because this is one of the problems, right? The corporates, it's very difficult to impose these taxes on corporates. This is where much of the resistance is. They fear competition. But what they also very much dislike is the chaos of all national taxation and 27 different systems. And I think that works also very effectively, for example, on the digital service tax. I think the big tech hates it. This is the main thing we have going for the Pillar 1 in the OECD agreement. The same is true, I think, from the CCCTB. My experience for that discussion was that there is an odd coalition possible between NGOs on the one hand and the corporates on the other hand, because the corporates just want to have, like I said, if we pay taxes and our competitors pay taxes, that is fine. So just give us the one-stop shop. That's still a possibility out there on the table. So in that sense, the chaos of all national measures may also help to bring forward a unified approach. It's a bit tricky scenario, but it's maybe.
When
okay.
you mentioned chaos, I first thought of the protests and strikes and sure. Anger and. I mean, there's different types of unrest and chaos. And indeed, I mean, having 27 different systems and 27 different measures introduced and perhaps, again, abolished one after the other will not help business and does not level the playing field. So we see an interesting shift where business communities are actually, business leaders are beginning to understand that within the current system they have they don't have a competitive advantage, they have a competitive disadvantage for their sustainable business models, and I think that could be a real game changer as well. So let's go to the audience. Do we have any questions? Yes, thanks.
Sorry, I will need you. I will bring you the mic, man. That's fine. That's much better. Here you go.
Chaos.
Or I can scream, thank you. Elodie Lamer with Tax Notes. I have 2 questions. First, to the 2 speakers. You've been asking for a scandal, and it seems to me that during this summer, we actually had a scandal with people using their private jets to fly short distance. In the Parliament, the Energy Taxation Directive has been put on hold, so the MEPs are not negotiating it at the moment. But I was wondering if we could not use the momentum of this public outcry during the summer to just maybe take kerosene tax outside of the directive and adopt something on it quickly, because if we have to wait for the ETD to be adopted, I don't know how long we're going to wait. And the second question, it's not exactly related to this conference, but a bit because you mentioned the overall tax mix. So I'm just pushing my luck with Benjamin. When are we going to go for enhanced cooperation on Pillar 2? Thank you.
Okay. On kerosene, it's worth recalling one element which has already been mentioned by Femke. We are in the process of extending the emission trading scheme to the aviation. As such, this is a very important step, which have indirect consequence also on the element you mentioned. Now go on your second question. The priority is still to try to get an agreement at 27. I think it is not impossible. As you know, there are other elements that may help influencing the discussion, which themselves have a calendar which is attached to the end of the year. So let's see first whether we manage to get the country which is not on board yet on board. I think everyone would agree that it's better to move at 27. As far as the Commission is concerned, we are willing to use any treaty procedure that is available to secure the swift adoption of the directive and maintain the ambitious calendar that was agreed collectively at the OECD and G20.
Let's take another question.
Yes, hi, Michael Lahmann from Ecopreneur here in Brussels. I know it's not a tax, but I'd like to put out the question to the panel, where are we with the plastic tax with a levy? I think considering the polluter pays principle and of course the Waste Framework Directive, I don't know if this works anyway. So considering the Waste Framework Directive also coming up, maybe you can give us a heads up where we are with the plastic tax.
The plastic tax.
I'm not an expert in plastic tax. I just know that the principle has been agreed for the own resource, and it's supposed to be 80 cents per kilo of non-recycled plastic packaging waste. And that the text has been adopted in 2021, if my recollection is correct. I speak under the control of Femke, which probably knows it better.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you can do this.
Well, well, to be honest, I think we should be talking about let's say the bigger drivers, and it's so easy to get bogged down by the details of specific measures, and we forget about the bigger perspective and the longer term and the major drivers in our economy. I mean, with 50% labor taxes and 6% green taxes, you know, a plastic tax or an aviation tax or, you know, a water tax for that matter won't change the fundamental drivers of how businesses take decisions and how consumers take decisions on their consumption pattern. So although very relevant, and it's an interesting development where plastic is actually included in the contribution and as a point of focus, I think it's very important. But for this panel, we were trying to focus on the bigger scheme of things and how we can support processes. I mean, with so much respect for the negotiation processes that go with that, behind every specific measure, how do we keep a broader perspective? Mr. Tang, would you like to
because
respond?
the broader perspective on the plastic tax, it's an own resource. And that is crucial to take this step. Like I said, one of the changes we can have is the carrot. So the common European expenditure on common on common European goods. We have done it in COVID times. We may not do it this time, but still, and therefore to make this carrot work, we need something like own resources. So that's a very important discussion. This will also change the dynamics in the future.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing is with the plastic tax, as I learned about it, there's no need for member state to actually pass on these costs to producers. So basically, it can be paid by the general tax revenues.
I was not trying to discuss the plastic tax. So I was trying to help you to move away from that to say its own resources. So.
Thanks. Now I'm going into the details of the.
You should not underestimate, nevertheless, Femke, one important behavioral consideration, which is member states always try to reduce their payment for own resources. So the minute you have this kind of tax, you create an incentive this time on the member states themselves to make progress in recycling plastics.
Okay, and I do think it will contribute to the conversation around the problems of plastics, which is huge, of course, with plastics ending up in every bit of our planet. So I think we have to leave it at that. Thank you very much for this conversation. Thanks.
I was waiting for this provocative question from this gentleman in the back. So there you go.
I think there will be questions.
Can you give him the mic?
Can
you give him the mic? Yes.
Apparently, Paul is forcing me to say something. And in my opening remark, actually, I was saying that we're not talking about tax today. We're talking about survival. Well, maybe that was putting it a bit far. But indeed, I think we still think the problem we have today with yesterday's thinking. And in reality, we're not talking about taxation. We're talking about making the cost of business real. We're just talking about, re-internalizing negative externalities, as economists like to say. So can't you imagine a way in the Parliament and in the Commission to slightly move away from taxation and talk about the cost of doing business? Because that's what we're really talking about. Can't you talk about the cost of redressing a totally broken market mechanism and making things work? This is what we're talking about. We're only talking about tax because it is the only tool we have. So I think we need to be a bit more imaginative in the circumstances that we face today and stop continuing thinking unprecedented challenges with tools of the past. So that's not giving you a solution, Paul. But I think you really need to break, consensual thinking within the Parliament and look at other ways. If the money that you collect to redress the pricing system goes into the state budget, it's called a tax. Well, maybe it needs to go somewhere else then.
No, I'm not sure that I probably agree, right? So you try to always take the debate broader. So, and in this sense, you would like to emphasize it's about fair pricing, right? Real pricing. Trying to take on board what are now called externalities, and this is what the work of Femke's in X-Tax project is all about, to show what the externalities are and how to internalize it and come to fair prices. In that sense, that's a part that the tax system plays. I think it only makes the argument for some of the taxes much stronger, if you so. It's part of a broader story. In that sense, we're always looking for. This is the quest: how to come to changes, and how to also have the stories that deliver those changes, right? At the same time, I think that the tax system in itself is also a tool for redistribution, so it's here to stay. So I think let's say 5 years from now, we have a fireside chat probably with different people, but you're still discussing taxation. Sorry for that.
And we can continue over coffee.
Would you like a final word on?
No, I agree with Paul. Tax is an important tool, but it's just one tool in a toolbox. So there are others, and obviously, if we want to get the big transition to a greener and more sustainable economy, taxation cannot be the only tool. There is a big need for public investment, and there is a big need also for some behavioral changes, which call for education also of the people and of the businesses, so as to make sure that everyone goes in the same direction.
Yes, of course, and yet again, with $5.4 trillion euros worth of financial incentives every year, which are the taxes that we raise collectively across the EU, there's no other policy that can go against that kind of, huge financial incentives. So I thank you very much for this conversation. I think it's food for thought, and I think we'll continue the conversation. As for the XX project, we'll be mobilizing more and more the business community, as Ecopreneur is doing, to illustrate how a tax shift can actually help support, scale up sustainable businesses and inclusive business models. So maybe that will help you as well in your work to illustrate why we're changing and why we should change the tax system and financial incentives, rather than how exactly and who is benefiting specifically. So thank you very much again for this conversation. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work being done. And I think we all have a role to play in that conversation. So you're invited. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very illuminating and interesting discussion. We are now about to go back online for our second round of contributors talking about their subject to their contributions that they sent to our sustainable tax systems. Do we have Stefan on the line? We will be running slightly late, so please, everyone online, stay tuned for the entire session. Of course, the people here won't get fed until we've finished anyway, so that's sorted. So, Stefan. So I'd like to introduce Stefan Kalbecker, Research Director of Cicero Centre for International Climate Research, and Stefan will talk about research insights on how the public views environmental taxes and how they can be designed for greater public support. Stefan.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak here today. You introduced briefly my topic. It's already been covered by the speakers to some extent, talking about unrest, chaos. I hope you can see my first slide. I cannot see myself, what you are seeing. Can you confirm that it's on? Oh, okay, anyway, I'll speak. I don't need my slides to speak. So I'm going to talk about research on public attitudes towards environmental taxes, based on research insights from using focus groups, lab experiments, surveys. This is a topic that has grown a lot over the last 5 to 10 years, based on key events like the Yellow Vest protests in France that triggered a lot of research, a lot of interest in this topic, because as we're moving forward with the green transition, we realize that public opposition to taxes is likely one of the key barriers. And we need to understand that barrier better in order to be able to move ahead with new tax designs, improved processes, ways of still ensuring that we can implement effective policies, but while having sufficient support from the public. Next, please. So I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to do a very brief overview of key research in this field. And if you want the details, you can contact me afterwards. So 10 to 15 years ago, this started with some qualitative work, doing focus groups, a few in-depth interviews, trying to understand how people view environmental taxes. And the view that came out of that was fairly positive. People generally do view taxes favorably as long as the revenues are earmarked. So to me as an economist, that was a bit of a surprise. It was an issue we were going to raise in the focus group, but before we ever got that far, it was raised by the participants themselves. So they want to see a very direct connection between the activities that are being taxed and how those revenues are being spent. So it's a very strong preference for earmarking for environmental purposes. They did realize some of the problems with that. Of course, it gives the governments less flexibility in how they spend money. And as a tax evolves over time, people adapt. The tax revenue should be going down if the pollution is being reduced. So they saw some of the problems. They did not at all by the economic double dividend argument, that by raising revenues from taxing a polluting activity, you can decrease other taxes, for instance, labor taxes. Did not see that connection at all, did not believe in it, didn't see the reason behind it. They wanted generally more information. How does this work? What happens to the revenues? And as mentioned earlier today, they also wanted to see alternatives. So if you introduce a fuel tax, people want to see, for instance, improved public transport at the same time, or subsidies for electric vehicles. So you want to see that your freedom of choice is not being restricted. You want to see that you retain some options for living your life the way you want to. Next, please. Lab experiments can be useful in obtaining more fundamental insights into people's behavior and thinking. So for instance, you can set up situations where it's clearly to the benefit of everyone to introduce a tax. You vote on that in the experimental setting, and you see a lot of people still opposing it. So it doesn't make sense rationally. But that's a useful tool for exploring what can change people's opinions and what does work. One thing that does work is experience. If people are exposed to tax, they see how it does change behavior, reduces accidents, noise, pollution, etc. It will increase support over time. Famously, you can see that in the Stockholm congestion change trial back in 2007 or so. That was very well studied. You saw that effect quite strongly. We've also discovered that taxes are less popular than subsidies because of greater uncertainty over costs and benefits. With a subsidy, you can quite often identify upfront, I'm going to gain from this, I can receive this subsidy. And it's not so clear how that's funded, that in the end that has to be funded through government budget, but that cost on you is much less obvious. Whereas with taxes, of course, you know you'll pay it upfront, you're not so certain about what happens with the revenues. That's a key difference here. So it seems to us that what was obvious to us as economists working on it, that if you reduce the externality, overall welfare will increase, is far from obvious to our subjects in these experiments, even when we try to explain it. Explaining it didn't change people's opinions to a very large degree. Next, please. And then finally, from large-scale surveys, nationally representative or cross-country, there's been hundreds of these surveys by now, and there's some big meta-analysis that study results across. And what they found is that public support for taxation depends crucially on perceived fairness. This was touched on earlier today as well. And fairness has a lot of aspects, procedural aspects, for instance, but the key one tends to be distributional impacts. So distributional impacts are key, and that's the strongest predictor of support or lack thereof for environmental taxes. The perceived effectiveness is important. Do people believe the tax will actually change behavior and reduce pollution? For instance, they do so only to a limited extent with fuel taxes. And of course, to some degree, they're right. The tax elasticity is not very high. It doesn't change behavior all that much. And it also depends on people's own environmental concern, i.e. whether or not they believe there is a problem there that needs solving. We do find in these surveys that there is majority support in the population for green taxes when we use the insights on best practices. So when you use these insights about providing alternatives, telling people exactly how the revenues are spent, etc., then we do find majority support quite often in these surveys. That could be in the form of earmarking revenues or fee and dividend schemes where you turn some of the revenues to the population directly. And a minimum in every case is clear information. Exactly what are the tax rates? How is this going to be raised? What happens to the revenues? What's the purpose of this? Those elements are always key to ensuring a sufficient level of support. One final thought that's important to add is that this is not a matter of finding that exact majority support. Sometimes you need a majority. Sometimes it's not sufficient because oppositions from industry groups, for instance, are overriding those concerns. So it's just one of the factors here, but it's one that by now has been relatively well studied. There is a lot of research to draw on when trying to design policies and ensuring a sufficient level of public support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, talking on a topic close to my heart, psychology. Apologies now for the next session for the damage I'm going to do to the German language. I would like to introduce Margit Schratzenstaller-Olzinger and Angela Körpel, senior economists at the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. And Angela and Margit will speak about environmental, economic and social impacts on carbon taxes.
Yes, thanks for inviting us to give an input on carbon taxes here. I think there is some echo.
We're not hearing echo here. We just had the wrong video feed up. So.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. I will start with some basic aspects, and Margit will then continue with the current empirical evidence on carbon taxes. In principle, the theory and the rationale for carbon taxes or the merits of environmental tax reforms is well documented. Economic theory stresses the steering effect and environmental effectiveness of carbon taxes. Carbon taxes set a price on the external effects of using fossil fuels via fiscal intervention. However, carbon taxes face some specific challenges. In theory, the appropriate price for environmental taxes is known. Once you know the exact marginal damage and abatement costs of your activities. In the context of carbon emission, this tax rate would then be the optimal carbon price. However, due to the complexities of the climate system, the determination of the optimal tax rate is restricted by a number of uncertainties. A further difficulty stems from the time separation of abatement activities and the impact on the climate system and the benefits from mitigation activities. Another challenge is that the effectiveness of carbon taxes may be weakened due to stock flow interactions or prevailing market barriers like the tenant-owner problem. For example, if the mobility system and the mobility infrastructure is built for car use, the existing long-lived infrastructure determines the options for mobility. And the one who has to pay the tax has no direct influence on infrastructure decisions. Another example is that the option to avoid the tax is restricted if a house owner has no incentive to improve the building structure, leaving the tenant with high energy consumption. However, I think even if the true social costs of carbon are not known and other barriers prevail, a carbon tax nevertheless has the strong signal that the costs of climate change need to be internalized in prices. One also needs to keep in mind that the transition to climate neutrality requires a profound structural change that cannot be achieved through incremental steps and that cannot be achieved by one single policy instrument. Focusing on the urgency of emissions reduction and the transformative signal of policy instruments, I think one can conclude that a high enough carbon tax is required to have an effective steering effect. Economic theory shows how important the specific design is in order to generate the desired effect of such a tax. For example, of avoiding unwanted distributional effects or unwanted negative growth effects. How these aspects are reflected in empirical research is now the focus of Margit.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Margit?
Okay, do you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Well, I will now provide a very brief summary of the main results of a comprehensive literature review together with Angela along several impact dimensions that were partially addressed in the interventions before already. The first one is the question of environmental effectiveness. Then the second one is the question of macroeconomic effects. And the third one are distributional aspects associated with carbon taxation. The most obvious question, of course, is whether carbon taxes are an effective instrument of climate policy. There is a large number of empirical ex post analysis that show that carbon taxes can effectively reduce carbon emissions or at least dampen their growth. However, the existing empirical research also suggests that the order of magnitude of the effects is rather modest and thus insufficient to reach the current medium and long-term emission goals as they are stipulated in international and national agreements and plans, which may have to do very obviously with the fact that in most countries carbon taxes still are rather moderate regarding their tax rates. And indeed, also empirical evidence suggests that the level of the carbon tax rate is a crucial factor for its effectiveness. Only an appropriately high carbon tax rate is able to effectively reduce carbon emissions. Empirical evidence also shows that demand may react more sensitively to long-lasting carbon taxes than to short-term price fluctuations. And this finding obviously is particularly relevant in the current situation. And one argument why current high prices for electricity and gas should not be counteracted by the reduction or the elimination of carbon taxes. Then there's the macroeconomic impact of carbon taxes. The large majority of empirical studies shows that carbon taxes are an effective carbon emission reducing tool, which does not negatively affect economic growth and employment. As the concrete design of carbon taxation varies in the countries that have been analyzed, it is difficult to identify the factors behind the overall positive or neutral effects on macroeconomic performance. However, a number of studies suggest that full revenue recycling via reducing social security contributions or the income tax is or at least one key factor and thus generating a double dividend. The third aspect are the distributional consequences of carbon taxes. There are numerous empirical studies that show that generally carbon taxes pose a disproportionate burden on low-income households. At the same time, there is also an empirical consensus in the literature that carbon taxes have differentiated distributional effects. In general, carbon taxes on fuels have a progressive effect in many countries, while taxes on heating fuels are slightly, and taxes on electricity are significantly regressive. And an also much debated and very topical issue, of course, is how to avoid or to at least mitigate the distributional effects of carbon taxes. Empirical research illustrates that the distributional impact of environmental and carbon taxes crucially depends on the use of tax revenues. Model simulation shows that lump sum transfers are better suited to mitigate regressive effects for lower incomes, while higher incomes very generally benefit more from a reduction in taxes on labor. And as Stefan already mentioned in his intervention before, avoiding negative distributional effects according to also to the empirical evidence is an important factor to secure public acceptance of carbon taxes. To conclude, carbon taxes need to be, and that was addressed before also, need to be considered in a broader perspective in the context of climate change. And it's important to keep in mind that the transition to climate neutrality requires a profound structural change that cannot be achieved through incremental political steps, and also that cannot be achieved only with carbon taxation. The focus needs to be on a broader policy mix that integrates a wide range of instruments, ranging from price-based instruments over subsidies, standards, public infrastructure investments. And several studies suggest that a strategic combination of all these instruments can also yield significant synergies. And not least, and this is my final sentence, the relevant literature suggests that international or at least EU-wide policy coordination brings about additional economic and environmental benefits. Thank you very much.
Very much, Margit and Angela. Next up, we have Walter Stahel, author on the circular economy and founder of the Product Life Institute. And Walter will speak on his passion of how to adapt tax systems to the vision of the circular economy. Walter, are you online?
Thank you, Sebastian. Could I have my slides, please? Anyway, you will have to do a lot of reading because you are reading faster than I can talk. So therefore, I prefer that I give you the gist and you do the reading. Next slide, please. So I would like to show you that sustainability or sustainable society and circular economy are two sides of the same coin. And so if we introduce a circular economy, we also increase sustainability. Next slide, please. Now in German, there's a lovely word, Steuern sind zum Steuern da, which in English means taxes are there to steer. And steering demands a strategic long-term vision, such as a circular economy. I have something that is blocking my, okay. And sustainable society built on renewable resources. European Commission defined circular economy as an economy where the value of products, value, is maintained for as long as possible. Renewable resources include labor, and it's the only resource with a qualitative edge of skills, expertise that can be greatly improved through education and training, but will rapidly decrease if unused. Next, please. So the first takeaway, caring. Caring is the foundation of sustainability. So therefore, caring workers should not be taxed. Caring activities is to maintain the value of the different assets. They are skill and labor intensive. The resulting products cannot be resold. The industrial economy considers them as unproductive and unsuitable. So forget the linear economy, the traditional economy. In the circular industrial economy, caring activities by people working in essential services are the basis to maintain the value of products, materials, etc. for as long as possible. So first conclusion, do not tax labor. Working in for a sustainable society, essential caring activities of the circular economy. Next, please. There are further benefits of not taxing labor. First of all, it will reduce the cost of all activities involving caring for nature, culture, health, education. You can see that Fritz Schumacher, who was an economist, I'm not an economist, already clearly stated the thing about education and people. In fact, there's a question if this poses an ethical priority to use labor as skills degrade if unused. So give a priority to use labor as a production factor rather than all the other ones. And then, of course, you have some more items. Next slide, please. Second takeaway, circular economy maintains the value of products. So it's about value preservation. So therefore, do not charge VAT on activities of the circular economy, because there is no value added, it's value maintained. And second point, which hasn't been mentioned so far today, give carbon credits for the prevention of greenhouse gas emissions. Because services which extend the product life of manufactured objects maintain the embodied greenhouse gas emissions and thus prevent new emissions by replacement products. But today there's no carbon credits. So conclusion, no VAT, but plain carbon credits on value maintaining service life extension will advance rapidly circular economy. Next, please. Further benefits of product life extension services: maintaining the existing stock of objects, buildings, infrastructure, equipment also saves the water that originally was used in producing these things. Again, water is a renewable resource, unique resource, and therefore activities that preserve using water should be given priority. Circular economy is built on economics, innovation, and competitiveness. Taxes are in the remit of member states, and therefore introducing this tax shift to promote a circular economy would actually increase the competitiveness of the member states that are doing it first. So the circular economy is about maintaining ownership of goods and embodied resource for as long as possible to gain high future resource security, price guarantees. It's competitive because it saves transaction and compliance costs, and achieve a big cost advantage over throughput linear producers. The motto is, the goods of today are the resources of tomorrow at yesteryear's prices. Next, please. The third takeaway, sustainability is a strategic long-term vision of mutually reinforcing policies. This is conclusion of the British RSA in 2003, promoting moving towards a zero-waste society through development of mutually reinforcing policies, products, technologies, behaviors, and lifestyles that reduce waste of all kinds, with zero waste as long-term ideal. Conclusion, sustainable taxation should be complemented with full producer liability, similar to pollution pays principle, sustainable public procurement, and sustainable taxation as mutually reinforcing policies to advance circular industrial economy and a sustainable society. Next, please. So why bother about taxation in the circular economy? Circular industrial economy is the only economic strategies I'm aware of to face all three of today's sustainable challenges: a low waste society, a low carbon society, and a low anthropogenic mass society, which at the moment is increasing at an incredible rate and killing biodiversity and natural resources. If you would like, next slide, please. If you'd like to know more, you can read my paper from 2013, published in the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society in London. Thank you for your attention. Next slide, please. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Unfortunately, we don't see each other in these cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Next up, and with apologies to any representatives of the airline industry here, we have Alithia Warrington, Campaigns Manager at Possible. Ali will present on Possible's views about how a progressive tax on frequent flyers would cut aviation emissions in a way that's fair and obtains public support. Ali, are you online? Yes.
Yeah, hi. Hi, everybody. So I'm from Kosovo, which is a climate charity based in the UK. So there's been a lot of discussion already about how policies to tackle the climate crisis by cutting emissions need to be fair in terms of their distributional impact in order for them to have public support. So we know that we need to put higher charges on more polluting services to reduce excess consumption. But those higher taxes need to be focused on wealthier people who pollute more and not on poorer people who have much lower consumption of high carbon products and services, and whose consumption is much more likely to be linked to be caused by survival emissions rather than by luxury emissions. So when it comes to aviation, who is taking the flights is really closely correlated to level of income. So even in wealthy countries, like those in Europe, which have high levels of flying, most people fly rarely or not at all, while most of the flights are taken by just a small group of frequent flyers. So there's no way to get aviation emissions into line with climate targets without reducing demand. Some flights have to stop, and so overall, the cost of flying has to go up. But if you try to reduce that demand per flight using only flat rate measures, such as an increase in passenger duty, that would mean that most of the reduction in flights comes from people on below average incomes who currently fly very rarely. Clearly, that would be really unfair and also unpopular. So that's why we're proposing using a frequent flyer levy to cut back on flights. This is a progressive tax which would increase per flight that each person takes in a given time period. So someone would pay low or no tax on their first flight each year and a higher rate of tax for each subsequent flight. So if somebody is taking their 10th flight that year, they would pay a higher tax on that flight than someone on the same plane who hasn't flown at all that year. So access to aviation is really, really unequal. Within the EU, there is just 17% of the population who fly more than once each year within the EU. And those people are responsible for 77% of those flights. So it's a huge chunk of the emissions from aviation coming from a relatively small proportion of the population. And this slide shows the proportion of spend on air travel in the EU by income quintiles. So the 20% of households with the highest income spend 14 times more on air travel than the whole of the lowest income quintile. So if tax measures to manage aviation demand are focused on frequent flyers, this would impose higher charges on wealthier households than poorer ones, and it would therefore be fiscally progressive. So how would a tax on frequent flying work? So it would need to replace existing flat rate taxes on air passengers. And it would leave most people either unaffected or better off. And it would target the higher taxes on people who fly the most. So it would need to be introduced along with other policy measures to limit demand for flights, including taxing jet fuel. So where we're at the moment is that tax breaks have kept the cost of flying artificially low. In the UK, the aviation industry doesn't pay VAT, and it also doesn't pay any tax on kerosene, and that amounts to 7 billion per year. So that's a total free ride from the taxpayer. It's really, really positive that the EU has started to move towards ending the exemption on kerosene for flights within Europe. But this flat rate tax, if it's introduced alone without a progressive element, is going to be much, much less fair in its distribution. So there's a risk that managing aviation demand with just a flat rate tax will prevent poorer people from travelling at all, while leaving high demand in higher income segments virtually unchanged. So we've modelled a comparative distributional analysis of achieving the same total reduction in flights with a flat rate tax measure compared to a progressive tax, which increases per flight each person takes. Sorry, could we go back to the previous slide, please? Brilliant, thanks. So this shows the percentage change in the average number of flights taken by individuals in each income group compared with a baseline of no policy interventions. So the pink bars show the change under a progressive policy like a frequent flyer levy, and the blue bars show a flat rate increase in departure tax. So under a progressive tax, the lowest income group will actually fly slightly more, while the reductions in flight are greatest among people in the highest income quintile who fly the most. But if you try and use just a flat rate tax, people with lower incomes reduce their flying more than people on higher incomes, even though they already fly the least. So clearly that would be an unfair and regressive outcome, which is not likely to get much public support. Could we have the next slide, please? So this shows an illustrative tax schedule, and this is set at a level which would constrain demand growth to 25% more than 2018 levels in the UK by 2050, which is, a fairly generous allocation of carbon budget for this sector, but it's what the UK's advisors on climate are calling for. So ideally, a tax on frequent flying should be implemented globally or regionally due to the international nature of air travel. And of course, the EU would be a really, really good place to implement this kind of progressive tax due to the high degree of integration and also the role as a global leader on climate. So finally, there's a lot of evidence that the public finds a progressive tax the most acceptable way to constrain demand for flights. So there's some polling in the UK finding that 89% of people support this type of tax because people can see this is a fair solution to the problem of aviation emissions. And, it's really clear that climate action needs to make people's lives better and our societies fairer. It can't just be about telling people that they can't do things or having things taken away from them in order for there to be public support for the speed and the scale required. And progressive tax policy has a really important role to play in achieving this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. Next up, we have Yannick Vark, Climate, Energy and Air Pollution Coordinator at Zero Waste Europe. And Yannick will present on how aligning economic incentives, such as those for climate and renewable energy, with the waste hierarchy would boost circularity in the EU. Yannick, are you online?
Yeah. Good afternoon. Can I have the slides, please? There you go. Okay. Well, just maybe we can start from here. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you for the introduction and also opportunity to contribute to this event on the taxes and in incentives. So when it comes to my work at Zero Waste Europe, then I focus mainly on end-of-life treatment of waste to ensure that this is done in a most sustainable way, but also perhaps more importantly, to ensure that economic incentives and subsidy schemes are directed from end-of-life treatment to prevention, reuse and recycling, and particularly towards prevention and reuse. So if you look at the what is the status quo at the moment, I think you have to click several times because I have this animation, so I'll just go ahead. So when it comes to circularity and circular economy and waste management in Europe, then we are actually largely still linear. So there's a very little circularity. In fact, waste generation continues to grow. And if you look at, I think even more importantly, many of the materials end up in so-called mixed or residual waste stream and simply get incinerated or landfilled. And that represents about half of the waste generated. So it's significant. So we are really taking our baby steps in the EU, and we tend to be seen as the leaders here. So there's a lot we can do. And what we also know is that taking business as usual approach to particularly to material production will lead to exceeding the carbon budget by almost 5 times. So very likely leading towards the trajectory of warming of 2.5 degrees. And plastics alone could actually be as high as 3.5 degrees. So it's significant. And I think one of the issues is that the focus so far has been mainly on recycling and limiting landfilling, which clearly is not enough. And in particularly, by focusing only on recycling, we know that there are limitations in terms of having a circularity at the material level. We just published a recent report which showed, for example, for plastics, it's depending on the technologies you're losing are 30 to more than half of the material in the process of recycling. So it's actually it's very clear that the future has to be about the product circularity, and that means greatly increased reuse. So yeah, if you should click several times because I had this animation there. So if you can just go ahead. Yeah, sorry. What I want to say is that part of the problem is that we don't have targets. So clearly we don't have any reuse targets, waste prevention targets. It's only about recycling and limiting landfilling. And what happens is it's clearly it's not enough. So unfortunately, I must say the Commission next year work program is extremely disappointing. It's now proposing not to revise the Waste Framework Directive in that sense. Not good at all. It's not going to provide the network that we are expecting for the decades to come. Just click for more then, because it's I have already mentioned also. Click several times more. Yeah. So yeah. So it's what is also important is not enough just to set targets as such, but it's also important that these targets are backed by economic incentives. So, for example, we know that half of the countries they got early warning reports for recycling targets. It's clearly because it's not enough just a target, but you also have to create the economic environment so that for this to happen. Yeah, good. Good. Next slide. That's good. I wanted to particularly point out on two issues. So first of all, so we have waste hierarchy. We have prevention at the top of the waste hierarchy, then followed by reuse and recycling, and then we have a recovery and landfilling. But what happens is that while the waste prevention, while the waste directives prioritize waste prevention, when it comes to the climate and particularly renewable energy subsidies, then in fact they are contradicting the waste directive goals because they are very much focused on what happens at the very end of the life cycle and encourage, for example, using of waste as a feedstock for so-called renewable energy. And I think there is a philosophical question, but also a practical question. Could we really consider waste as a renewable feedstock? I believe this argument has never been really credible. We know that waste prevention sits rightly at the top of the waste management hierarchy. And I believe that no industry sets out with an objective of generating waste. So wasted materials represent wasted embodied energy and emissions. So as long as we have waste, it should, of course, be managed, but in the context of the framework designed to reduce its generation. So by giving renewable subsidies for promoting energy from waste, it undermines this goal of minimizing waste. And in particular, I would highlight that the current renewable energy directive is particularly problematic as it sees separate collected bio-waste as an energy source next to a biogenic fraction of mixed waste at the same level, meaning that it sort of gives subsidies for both on same conditions, while mixed waste is something that we do want to limit. And while separately collected waste is something that we aim for. So there is a clear problem in there. And when it comes to also the carbon systems, I think that has been already mentioned by several times by previous speakers. Then one of the effective ways of actually driving away from kind of end-of-pipe treatment is to actually have carbon pricing. And I think here we should not wait for another decade to include, for example, incinerators and landfills in the scope of the EU ETS. And this is very much in line with the with the current goals of the Waste Framework Directive. So, for example, in point 8 Annex 4 clearly says that we should be phasing out subsidies which are not consistent with the waste hierarchy. And so there is a clear need for removing renewable subsidies, particularly for mixed waste, in order to promote separate collection, and also to include emissions from incinerators and possibly from landfills in the scope of EU ETS in order to drive better design, but also better sorting, recycling, including mixed waste sorting. And ideally, this would be later on expanded to also to biogenic emissions in order to include all emissions, because for the climate, it doesn't really matter if the emissions are from fossil carbon or biogenic carbon, because in the end, it's the same. And just one last thing, let me highlight also the importance of the timeline. So we don't have time we have 10 years left, maybe maximum. So clearly, the early action before 2030 will have a more impact in terms of strategies, and anything coming after 2030 will have a less effect. And so the focus has to be really short-term action. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Yannick. And last and certainly not least of our live presenters is Maria Volonen, Head of Taxation Policy at the Technology Industries of Finland. And she will be discussing what sustainable taxation is from a business point of view. Maria, are we live? Yes?
Yes, I'm here.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So you can go to the next slide. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. And I know that I'm the last one between this presentation and then the lunch, so I'm sorry, and I will try to be fast. So this first slide is the main point is just that TIF is an organization representing a lot of different businesses, so not just IT, but we have 1,800 companies, and we are the largest export sector in Finland. Next slide, please. So to say or summarize my message is that from the business perspective, we hope that the discussion around sustainable taxation would be, there would be like a big picture kept in mind all of the time. The last slide that I have will show that the companies really do understand the economical benefit from sustainability as well. And it's clear that there are economical benefits as well, on top of understanding that we are in a hurry to do something. So the risks are huge, but the possibilities are huge as well. And then I liked what Paul Tang said, that the companies don't mind paying taxes if the other companies pay taxes as well. And I would say that that is the yellow box there, so global cooperation. To reach better and efficient results, we need global cooperation, but it also affects the competitiveness. So not to have unilateral domestic taxes, but EU level or global level taxes is the best solution. So here to summarize, taxation is a toolkit, also the sustainable taxation, and it's not a goal as such. So we need to know what we want to have before we can choose which tool to use. And it has to be green, fair, digital, and the global cooperation is a very important part there as well. There has been discussion on green and fair and digital here, so I'm not going into depth in these aspects, but I will take the next slide, please. So we here at TIFF did a low carbon roadmap research. It was published 2020 and it will be updated this fall and next spring. Based on that roadmap, we identified these factors as being important in the going towards low emission business. So this describes also the large picture that I was mentioning. So sustainable taxation is not just meat tax or plastic tax. It's also considering that corporate income taxation is so competitive that the manufacturing will be kept in countries where the manufacturing is more sustainable. So, for example, EU countries have a very large possibility to. I hope my picture did not froze, but it seems to be like that. So based on our roadmap, we figured or calculated that for Finland alone, there is we could have 3 billion yearly more of green exports. So that just in Finland. Oh, my connection is a bit unstable. I'll turn off the camera if that's okay. Okay, sorry for that. So if it's just 3 billion in Finland alone, just imagine how much the volume could be in EU. But here you can see, so we need rules. We need, and not just fair in business level, but also on country level. We need intelligent energy system, and we need low emission electricity. Because, for example, digitalization does not happen if we don't have energy, and it has to be low emission. Or, for example, hydrogen, which is, sorry, in Finland, steel production could go zero emission with the hydrogen production, but and that could cut 7% of emissions of all Finland's emissions. So huge possibilities, but we need low emission, so green energy to produce clean hydrogen. So this is a must. We need R&D incentives, and we need a steady environment. So next slide, please. This is a survey or a study that we just published 5 days ago. We asked our companies how they see sustainability and its effects or economically. So the focus was here. So the benefits and bottlenecks of sustainability, effective actions, important and role of voluntary sustainability actions, future prospects and levers, and the role of sustainability in financial performance. And the next slide, and that's my last slide, is concentrating on the financial results. I hope you see this better than I do. The white font was maybe not the best solution. So the companies really see that sustainability is, it has an economical benefit. So And they even say that non-sustainable business is old business. It's going to die. So there is no other possibility than to be sustainable. And there was, I think Paul Tang mentioned that the companies are waking up, but they are not waking up. They have been for years waiting for actions for countries or from countries and politicians. And for example, one SME that I talked with said that they have been doing 20 years of work going sustainable. And I was like, well, that sounds really good. And then they said, yes, I know, we are too late. So 20 years for SMEs is too short time for sustainability. So we should have done this decades ago, but that just shows that we are in a really hurry. So here you can see that which individual sustainability actions will have the greatest general impact, and then which actions generate the greatest financial results. And this is pretty interesting results, and you can read the whole survey on our webpage. There's a summary in English, but I can translate it, or a translation is coming. So the greatest financial results were based on reducing consumption of natural resources and raw materials. So it's circular economy, and I really enjoyed the Walter Stiles mentioning that the circular economy maintains value, but for companies that means that it cuts costs because the same material can be used again. Use of renewable energy only is crucial, like I mentioned. So that has to be available. Promoting employee well-being, that's one of the greatest financial results elements. So the companies really value their employees. Promoting a diverse working environment, designing products and services to be socially sustainable, and then improving profitability. So here's just a sneak peek of the survey, but like I said, to sum it up, we have to see the big picture. We have to consider the taxation as a whole, not just to say that green taxation would be some small, like meat taxes or so forth, but it has to be a holistic, the whole large picture of taxation. Then to realize that the companies do understand, they do want to be sustainable, they see the economical benefit, but also that companies are run by people and employees, so they have the same worries that every other people have. So to understand that the companies are working with everybody else, so we can have to do this. We must do this together because we are in this together. So we only have one globe, and we have to do the actions together, and not to think that the business would be in some way trying to slow things down. The business want to go faster in this matter. And then I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but then just one thing more. The BEFIT model, so the previously known as CCCTB, so the Single Corporate Tax Rulebook for the EU. The BEFIT initiative was just released a week ago, and it mentioned that the BEFIT models should support green and digital transition. but I'm not sure how this is actualizing in the model. So I would hope that, for example, R&D tax incentives, which are very important in the green inventions, will be considered in the tax base calculation. And then there is another element. There is a formulary apportionment based on which the tax will be, or taxation rights will be shared between the member companies. There is a question whether intangibles should be included in the formula, and now it's just tangible assets, labor, and sales by destination. I would like to raise a question of if this formula is based on CCCTB, which is 15 years old. Is this really the way forward to have an up-to-date business tax model? And shouldn't the intangible be added to the formula? And also, should ESG strategy or value be considered an intangible as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions in the auditorium, or I don't know, Johan, is there anything on Slido? Does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists? I'm not seeing anything. So I just think it just remains to thank all of the contributors to our project, all of the speakers here today, the audience online, and indeed those who've braved it to the room. Please stay online for the final video, which is Thomas Pogge, who's Leitner Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Yale University, who has some very interesting ideas on how to promote innovation in green technology. In fact, he's come up with the term greenovation, which I quite like. So we will play out with this video. Thank you all very much, and keep checking our website for future events and the future of our sustainable tax project. Thank you. Goodbye.
Reversing the tax on deploying greenovations. New green technologies, greenovations, are everywhere rewarded with monopoly patents that enable originators to reap substantial markups or licensing fees from early users. But such monopoly rents raise the price of innovative technologies and thereby impede their diffusion. The more affluent countries offset this headwind through environmental regulations, levies on emissions, or green subsidies, all of which make green technologies more competitive with dirty ones. Poorer countries don't do this. They find it unfair that they should be expected to slow their own economic development when today's high-income countries emit it with abandon during similar developmental phases. And they anticipate that the increased use of greenovations in their territory would come with massive outflows of monopoly rents to green patentees who are overwhelmingly located in richer countries. As a result, green technologies diffuse very poorly in poor countries, where cheaper, older, dirtier technologies continue to be deployed. This is a big problem. In the remainder of our century, these countries will experience massive economic growth, intensified by large population increases. The technologies they will use, the practices and habits they will form, the roles they will be prepared to play in the fight for a livable planet will matter far more than any choices affluent nations will make within their own borders. The richer countries should solve this problem by spending some of the annual 100 billion they promised the developing world for mitigation and adaptation on creating a green impact fund for technology, or GIFT, that would enable originators of green innovations to exchange their monopoly privileges for impact rewards. The invited exchange would apply only in the lower income countries. An originator permanently forgoes, throughout this gift zone, any monopoly rents it could earn from its registered technology, and the gift rewards this technology for emissions averted with it in the gift zone through deployments completed within 6 years of market entry. The gift would greatly improve diffusion in the Global South by inducing originators to waive licensing fees and monopoly markups, and by incentivizing them to promote the fast, wide, and impactful deployment of their technologies. In addition, the gift would stimulate development of additional green innovations, especially tailored to the gift zone, thereby also contributing to capacity building there. Gift rewards might be paid through annual disbursements. Any registered green innovation would participate in 6 consecutive such disbursements, each divided among registered innovations according to emissions averted with them in the gift zone in the preceding year. Because participation is optional, the gift's reward rate emerges endogenously. When originators find the going rate unattractive, registrations dry up and the reward rate rises as older innovations exit at the end of their reward period. When the reward rate is seen as generous, registrations multiply and the reward rate declines. Such equilibration reassures participating originators and contributors that the reward rate will be fair between them and stable over time. The gift would organize a wide competition across the whole green innovation sector, including electricity generation, traffic, residential and office heating and cooling, construction, meat production, agriculture, forestry, industrial manufacture of steel, cement, and other commodities. High-impact green innovations from all these areas would be competing on one gift-created market toward the single goal of averting emissions. In this competition, all can be winners, earning premiums in excess of their investments. Highly compatible with Sustainable Development Goals 13 and 17, the gift model should urgently be piloted with a single reward pool over a 2-year trial period. There is no better way of reducing emissions than by ensuring that the best green innovations human ingenuity has devised are actually deployed widely, rapidly, and effectively. The gift would make that happen in the Global South. Thank you.
Staying to watch the video.